All right, thank you for your patience this morning and waiting for our latecomers to get in and get settled. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today on secure access to research results through the Key Findings platform within MarketSight. For those of you who haven't been on a webinar with me before, who haven't spoken with me, my name is Ann Schaefer. I am the Senior Customer Success Specialist here at MarketSight. I generally work with our customer success area, as you well know, and if we have questions today, there is a chat box where you can enter those. We'll do our best to answer those that are relevant at the end of the session, and then of course I will follow up with you afterwards if there's something perhaps project specific you need to know. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. What we're going to take a look at today is a quick overview of the process of taking your data from upload through analyzation, visualization, and ultimately sharing through that Key Findings platform. So we're going to be discussing the overall workflow where you would say take your Excel file, make new and interesting crosstabs, and then essentially make charts or even dashboards of those numbers and put it into Key Findings to share with other users. You'll find that we'll cover some best practices today, so we're going to discuss these as we get to the different areas. But just in general, keep in mind that organization is a great idea to start off with. You'll want to think about scale, especially if you're going to be working with multiple data sets or multiple users. You'll want to work with some of our security features, and again, we'll point these out when we come to them. And then always a test user is a great idea for the client experience to get a sense of that. Now let's go ahead and switch over to the application here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up MarketSight. With the Key Findings application, let's take a brief look at that section of the application if you haven't seen it before. Key Findings is more or less a component of MarketSight overall, and it's a portal system through which you can share different kinds of findings and feedback with your users. If you take a look here on the left, you'll see a list of different kinds of items. These can be organized into folders, and there's that first keyword there, organization. These folders can have, of course, multiple items placed within them, and then permissions can be set on each of the folders so that different clients can see different kinds of content. That content can be made within MarketSight, so things like crosstabs, for example, dashboards perhaps, or even individual charts, or perhaps even related files, so things made outside of MarketSight, like Excel, Word, PowerPoint, or PDF documents, can all be added to the Key Findings portal and ultimately shared with a client user. Now, as mentioned earlier, we're going to essentially start from scratch here, and we're going to begin this back on that initial part of our process or our workflow. The idea is that you would have gone through the data sets, you would have uploaded something and of course worked with your variables. You would have made some crosstabs and some charts from those, and ultimately likely even place those into dashboards. Switching over to the dashboards page now, I'm going to go ahead and open up this dashboard. Now, this particular dashboard has a number of interesting charts, and of course, I probably want to share this with someone. It's likely that this is going to do, of course, no good when given to myself. I need to share this with, say, a colleague or a client for maximum use. Now, to get this into their hands, I have several different options. If I take a look under the Share button here, you'll see that we have three. The first to begin with is email a link. Now, this is not quite the same as the other two, and it's distinctly different from Add to Key Findings. So let's take a moment to discuss that briefly. Email a link is intended for those, say, one-up circumstances where you want to send an individual item to someone, and that particular person does not have a MarketSight login. This link can be set to expire. So I could say grant someone a week of access or perhaps permanent access to a particular object. However, in terms of scalability, this one's a little bit less useful. Although I can put in multiple email addresses, it's not possible for me to take multiple objects and share them through this method at once. I would have to go to each object I want to share and utilize this function to then enter my email addresses. This is also less than ideal if you're working in a situation where you want to have a little bit of security, such as the login around these findings. If you'll take a note right here at the very top of this dialog, Note that this is basically a free access item. If someone has this URL, they're able to get to this item, be it a dashboard, crosstab, or chart. They are not prompted to log in. They will simply see the item within a blank window. So if you're again looking for a little bit more security, this is probably not your best bet. More or less, again, definitely intended for those one-of experiences. Now, the next option is great for, say, a fellow colleague. If you wanted to send them a link to this dashboard to, say, take a look at, check the work. Again, not great for necessarily doing things in bulk. So if you wanted to share multiple items with someone, perhaps you made multiple dashboards as part of a report to send, this may not be your best bet. It is different from emailing a link in that this one is going to prompt that user to log in. So a full access user would log in, entering their credentials. They would be taken to this item, be able to even say take a look and edit it if you've given them permission to do so. But since they are then within the full MarketSight interface, they see that full experience and they're able to then go on and do their own work. Finally, the last option, and the one that we're really interested in today, is the one to add the key findings. Now, the idea with key findings is that, again, I might have multiple objects that I need to share, and I want this to be in a secure fashion. So I want somebody to have to log in order to see this information. For this particular dashboard, I might choose to also add this to a folder for the sake of adding permissions specific to a client. Again, organization is key. The more you add, the more you're going to want to use it. So I recommend starting with folders when you very begin. All right, so I'm going to click OK there. That's going to add a Client C folder. And since this is highlighted, my dashboard will be placed into the Client C folder. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now I'm going to take a quick look at that through that Key Findings portal. Now, when I do this, it's important to keep in mind that what I'm seeing at this moment is what I see as an administrator. So when I go into the Client C folder, I'm able to easily expand that and look at that dashboard, but I see it within the MarketSight context. So I see the full site navigation, I see all of the folders and all of the different items, and I have a number of different capabilities here. For example, I could set this particular dashboard as an opening page. So that way it's more like a website when someone comes to visit it. They might see this dashboard loading basic metrics, for example. Now, the experience as a key findings user is going to be a little bit different. But before we get to that, we need to discuss how to get permissions and users set up correctly for that user to be able to access this object. So let's take a look at creating and considering that user access. One of the first considerations, of course, is permissions. And this is another reason why we definitely suggest creating folders when working in key findings. It makes it much easier to create permissions for multiple objects. But we also need to set permissions on a more general level for the item itself through the data sets. So we're going to come to that shortly, but before we get to really giving permissions, there must be something or a user to give permissions to. Let's take a look at that now. Heading over to my username in the upper right-hand corner, I specifically want to see the administration link. Note that this link is only available to users who are company administrators. So this is typically the first user who has signed up for the account. If you do not see the administration link, that means you need to be granted administrator rights in order to do so. Now, if I click on the administration link, that's going to take me directly to my users page. And this is where we first begin to take a look at the different users and user types within our account. Over here on the right-hand side, in the upper right-hand corner, we're going to see a list of user types, how many I have total, how many are in use, and in the case of a full access user type, how many are left free. Note that there is no total specified, nor free seats specified for key findings users. This is important because what this means for you is that you can create as many key findings users as you want. Now, a full access user, I would need to have a seat free, aka I would need to have a license for them. But in the case of a key findings user, since they're really only consuming that content, I can make, again, as many as I need. Now, taking a look at my individual users here, let's say, for example, we'll look at the new user dialog. Underneath the new user dialog, let's take a look at some of these fields that are important and those that we should skip. The first that's important is, of course, the username. This needs to be globally unique, so the user can't have the same email address as another person, or say if they had a previous trial within the MarketSight system. Now, if you have trouble setting up a unique username, that's okay. Just reach out to us at Customer Success, and we'll be happy to help. We do typically recommend email addresses. Everybody tends to remember their email address, whereas if your, say, login was first name dot last name and a number, that may be something a little less easy to remember. So email address is suggested. First name and last name are required, but middle name and title can be skipped. Another important field is going to be email address down here. Now this may seem redundant, but it's actually quite important. It's a little bit different from the username. In this particular field, if I say forget my password, and I click on that forgot password link on the home page when I try to log in, the reset email will go to this location. So this can and often is the same email as the username, but it's often something separate. So in the case of a user who might wish to control the access for their key findings users, they might put their own email address in here instead. Now, company, of course, not required. You probably know what company they're from, but of course it can always help to put in that information. Finally, down below, the last two boxes that are important are going to be users active, that will be key, and then of course send login information. Now what this send login information link does right here is it sends the new key findings user a login email that prompts them to set their security question as well as their own password. This method is preferred over setting a password manually on the Passwords tab. Now you can certainly do this. You can go through the Passwords tab, choose a password for the user, but then you actually have to tell them what it is. And of course, sending a password through email is less than secure. So as a security measure, we do recommend the use of that Send Login Information button. Now the Groups tab is one that we're going to come back to in a little bit. But we want to consider, again, that organization and making means more efficient. So instead of, say, establishing individual permissions, again, we could, but it's probably more efficient to use groups. So we're going to come back to this shortly. Privileges is important for this one right here, this checkbox to make this user key findings only user. Now the remainder of the tabs in this particular section, all of these checkboxes, for example, you can select them if you would like, but for the most part, they're really not going to make a difference. A key findings only user is really only going to see a specific area of the platform. They're not going to be able to make new data sets. They won't be able to create new crosstabs, for example, and they certainly can't go in and make new dashboards. So you can skip these boxes. Just make sure that you select the item Key Findings Only. The remaining two tabs, Contact Info, is going to be pulled by default from the accounts. You can skip this one. And then the last tab, Accounts, is one that only system administrators see. So I see this as a result of my personal login, and you will likely not see this account setting. All right, so that is the new user dialog here. And just as a note, if you have multiple users to add, you can do that in a more efficient manner by hitting Save and Add Another. That will refresh the dialog. Now, we had mentioned groups and putting users into groups. And the reasons why we recommend this practice is that, of course, it's much easier to manage multiple users when they are part of a single group. For example, as you can see here, this particular user, Noah Johnson, is a member of this Atlanta Managers group. So is my MarketSight trainee. That means that if I change the permissions for my Atlanta Managers group, that changes for both users at once, rather than me having to set these items individually one by one. So let's take a look at the groups and setting up user groups. Up in the site navigation, there's the Groups link. And when I go to the Groups page, I'll click on New to create a new group. All right, so as far as the name goes, of course, a descriptive name is probably preferred. For the moment, for the sake of this training session, I'll just put in today's date. So I'll call this the 528 training group. The description for the group is not required. However, it can be useful if you are administering this account with someone else. This will allow them to know the users or the kinds of users that you intend to put into this group. Role-based views is an interesting feature that's beyond the scope of our training today, but could be something to experiment with in the future. Essentially, what this particular function does is it allows you to filter data sets based on a variable included within that data set. For example, if I happen to have a region variable, I could put in a code or a label from that particular variable, and that will filter out the data. So I could say, have those Atlanta managers see only Atlanta manager data. Now, the next tab, Members, is one place where I can add members. This is, of course, going to be the easiest way to add multiple people because I can then say, select those particular users, and then move them over, just like that. Now, what's interesting is that it's actually possible to put in groups within groups. This can be something that you might want to do. It can also potentially be confusing. So if you're worried that you might mix up your groups, just make sure that you're looking for specific users. And you'll typically know the difference between the two, a group and a user, because a user will always have their email address or their username behind their actual name information. So I'll just move over my MarketSight trainee. Now, the Permissions tab is one that you can generally skip. This is going to be for this particular group itself. So people, if they have administrative access, could come in and edit the permissions for this group. However, because this group is going to be comprised mostly of key findings users and myself, it's really not applicable to the situation, and I can more or less skip this particular tab. Likewise, because I'm making a key findings users group, I can skip the Privileges tab. The key findings users simply don't have access to these areas, so whether I check them or not really makes no difference. Therefore, the most important are going to be the Basics and the Members tab. All right, we're going to click OK there. All right, so we now have our lovely training group in place. There is one thing I want to point out that's very important to understand about the groups and the users, and that is the fact that every user by default is going to be a member of the general users group. So when you are making specialized key findings access groups, you'll want to make sure that they are no longer a part of the general users group. In this case, we can see that I should be fine. These particular groups, I don't see general users for either of those key findings users. However, if I wanted to say set the permissions for this fellow, I would definitely want to remove him from general users and then add him to a specific group. The idea with general users is that, of course, it's most useful for, as you might have guessed, the generic or general situation, where anyone who wants to access any content can. But in this situation, generally speaking, you're going to want to remove those users from that group and then add them to a specific group instead. Now, that can be done on the Groups page, as we just did when we added those two users to the training group, or you can always, again, open up that user dialog and add them to specific groups here. If you need to remove them from groups, you would simply select that group and move it back to the left. Now, that's setting up the users and the groups. So we've got essentially the next part of that process done. But this doesn't mean that we're quite done because we actually still have to set the permissions on the content itself. Heading back to the Home tab, what we want to consider are the kinds of content that we're sharing and therefore where we need to send those permissions. The first is that I want to make sure that the data itself is going to be visible to the user. In order for me to do that, I'm going to head to the Datasets page, and I'm going to make sure that I right-click on the folder in which the relevant dataset is located. Underneath the properties for that particular folder, I'm going to make sure that I click on the Permissions tab and then choose Modify. In this case, I will add in my training group, and I'll click OK. Now, at this case, too, this is a series where, although I can set edit and permissions, it may not really matter. since my users for this training group are key findings only, viewing is really all they'll be able to do. Again, for the sake of organization as well as personal sanity, we recommend that you work with the groups. So that's going to be this first section towards the top here. And we recommend that over working with individual users. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So that's going to mean that this training group now has access to view the Millennials folder in this case and the data sets that it contains. Again, those folders come in handy. We may seem to be emphasizing this quite a bit, but it just makes it a lot easier because if I take a look at the properties for this particular data set, I will see that it's inheriting the permissions from that parent folder. This makes it possible for me to actually set the permissions for multiple data sets in one go. So it's much more efficient than doing data set by data set by data set level permissions. All right, so that's the first step there. We made sure that they have access to that most basic aspect, the content itself. Now we want to make sure that they also have access to the dashboard. Dashboards are separate from data sets because they can contain content from any data set that you have in your account. They actually have individual permissions set for them. So I'm going to make sure to select my dashboard and check the permission settings. Looks like I'm going to need to add my group here. So again, I'll click on Modify. That should show me a list of all my groups. I'm going to make sure to move them over to this side and click OK. All right, so when I click OK, that should be applying that setting there. Now, the very last thing I do want to make sure that I check, just in case, is the folder itself. So, as you might recall, I had made the folder in Key Findings, Client C, before I set up my user group. Therefore, I need to make sure that I go back and change those permissions so that the group is included. Note as well that general users are present. Again, that's the default setting. So if you do not want everybody to see this folder, make sure you get rid of the general users while you're moving over your particular user group. All right, so we've now set the permissions on the data set, so the content. We've set permissions on the frame or the dashboard, and then we've set the permissions on the folder organization within Key Findings itself. Let's take a look now as that MarketSight trainee user who is a member of the training group. This user is a Key Findings only user. So when this logs in, you'll see that they see a little bit of a different view than what I see as a full administrator. And I can move this over to the side just so we can more easily compare those two windows. For example, on the left-hand side, my administrative user, I see the full MarketSight interface. In comparison, my Key Findings user does not. My Key Findings user also doesn't have all of those options, like, say, creating an edited description for my particular object or, say, exporting the copy. They can export and they can share, but they're not really going to go set permissions or anything like that. In fact, as you can see as well, they may not see everything. My training user can't see the Client A folder, for example, simply not there for them. However, Client C, if I go ahead and take a look at that, on both occasions, you'll see both my administrative user can see that, as well as my Key Findings user. Switching back over to that Key Findings user in full screen here, right now I'm looking at it in, again, that organizational list-based view, but all I need to do is simply click on that dashboard in order to load it. Since we specified the permissions for the content, the dashboard as well as all of the charts and KPIs within the dashboard now load. Again, at this point, my user could say share this with someone. If I had enabled interactive filtering for them, they would be able to utilize this and then export it. The format that the item exports to ultimately depends on the object that we're looking at. In this case, a dashboard would go to PowerPoint or to image. Something like a simple top box crosstab, for example, would be exported out to Excel, PDF, or PowerPoint. Now, again, this Key Findings user requires me to set up those permissions. And this is, of course, not something that most of us do on a daily basis. Therefore, we generally recommend making a test user in order to get comfortable with the experience not only of setting up the permissions, but also so that you're able to test what that user sees. That's the primary reason why my MarketSight trainee user exists. That way, if I think I might need to set up specific permissions, I can add this user to a group and test that out. It will definitely make you feel much more comfortable when you know exactly what they're going to be seeing because you've seen it yourself. Now, mentioning seeing things as well, I should point out, if you have 5 or more enterprise-level seats, you're actually able to customize the look and feel of the key findings portal. At this point in time, this is the default look. So this sort of dark navy blue, almost black background in the top bar, the MarketSight logo. Well, you might want something a little bit more relevant to your company or brand, for example. So this can be customized. The color as well as the logo can be changed. And then the URL can be partially changed as well. So our data center still requires MarketSight.com be a part of the URL, but the application component can be adjusted. So this could be company name.marketsight.com, for example. All right. So overall, we've taken a look at everything. Just as a quick summary of what we've done today, I will bring up our lovely slide here. We've taken a look at the basic workflow. So we've summarized uploading data, creating our findings, and then sharing those. And we discussed the way to do that by adjusting permissions for key findings users. We've also mentioned several best practices for using key findings. So you want to make sure that you're organized. Don't put everything into the same folder, especially if you're going to do this for many clients. You'll want to be able to work to scale. So if you're working with multiple users or multiple data sets, use groups and use folders. You want to work with your security options. So make sure to use the send login info option instead of setting a password manually. And then finally, always create a test user so that you have a good feel for what the client will be seeing. All right, so let's take a look at some of our questions here. Give us just a moment to bring those up. All right, so we have one question here about customization. So the way to customize the key findings portal here is to essentially reach out to either your account manager or to us at customerservice@marketsight.com. Your account manager could be your salesperson that you initially spoke with, or if you're in the renewal stage, most likely Michelle. But once you've reached out to them, what they will ask you for are a few specific things. They'll ask you for a logo, preferably horizontal, in JPEG or PNG format, and they'll ask you for the hex codes or RGB values for 2 colors. The first color that you specify will be used to replace this dark navy blue, and the second color that you specify will replace this lighter blue that's used in the site navigation. Finally, they'll also ask you for a URL. So again, you'll be able to replace the application that you see here with your own choice. So brandname.marketsight.com. Once you've submitted that material to them, they'll go ahead and they'll send it into our engineering team, who will create a preview of that site customization for you so that you're able to approve it before it goes live. All right, let's take a look at some of our other questions here. All right, looks like we have one on the groups in the datasets page. So the question is about how they're not seeing the group that they added. And the reason for that is most likely going to be we need to go a little bit upstream. That may seem vague, but hear me out here. For example, let's say we have this travel study down here in my training folder. If I go and take a look at the properties for this, let's say I wanted to add my training group that we created today. Clearly right now it's inheriting from that folder training permissions, but for the sake of time, let's just say we're going to set these individually. Great, I'll hit modify, and I don't see that user group there at all. Now the reason why is that again we need to work a little bit upstream. So not only do we need to be able to see the content, but in order to do that in the first place, that group needs to be able to see the folder. So if I don't see my group at the dataset level, chances are very good I need to work back to that folder and check the properties there. Heading to my Permissions tab on the folder here, if I choose to modify, I should see my training group there, and I'll move them over. Great. Now when I confirm this change, if I go back to that travel study, this should be inheriting by default, but again, we should be able to customize it if need be, and that group should now be present. So we'll just go ahead and check that Permissions tab, and it looks like, yes, they have been added by default. Since we're here, a good thing to keep in mind is that once you deselect this option to use the folder permissions, that's never automatically reselected, so just do keep that in mind when deselecting this. All right, let's take a look and see if we have any more questions here. Yes, data views can be shared. We didn't mention those specifically, but they absolutely can be shared through key findings. So that's a great scenario for if you happen to have, say, a series of open ends, for example. You could place that into a data view and either add that to a dashboard or put it into the key findings portal. All right, so that looks like it's it for dashboard/key findings permissions related questions. We have a couple of extra that will follow up with you through email. Thank you so much for your time this morning in going over how to share your findings through the Key Findings platform. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.